Welcome to the All About You podcast. My name is Sheila and I am your host. In this podcast, I invite people to tell their stories of their travels, hobbies, and passions. These podcasts are also now available on my All About You YouTube channel. So if you have a story to tell, please contact me on allaboutyoupodcast@yahoo.com and let's tell your story. Welcome to the All About You podcast. And today my guest is Louise Mercieca, and she is a nutritional therapist, and we are talking all things food. Louise, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sheila. Thank you for having me.
So, Louise, can you introduce yourself and explain what a nutritional therapist is?
Yes, I basically don't just talk about people's sort of diets and what to eat and what not to eat and, do meal plans and those kinds of things, because food has a much deeper relationship. So I tend to work with people's food relationships. So very much about your food decisions, food habits, food behaviors, and that then drives what we actually put in our mouth. But we can't just focus on telling people what to eat and what not to eat when we haven't worked out their food relationships and habits. So that's where it all starts in the head. So that's where I focus.
Well, this is so fascinating, Louise, because I particularly wanted to talk to you about the psychology of eating. And particularly, I believe females tend to have quite a complex relationship with food, more so than men. And my experience over the years is men see food as fuel. Most men will eat what's put in front of them and have you got any more potatoes? Women, on the other hand, we spend a lot of money going to diet clubs. We spend a lot of money on magazines and books. The dieting industry alone is just, the money sloshing around is just unbelievable. Can we start picking apart then about women and food? Because women tend to use food to celebrate. Oh, something's gone really well. I'm going to treat myself with some chocolate. I've had a terrible day. I'm going to treat myself with some chocolate. Let's try and unpick that if we can.
We can unpick that, but I would say that men are definitely in the mix there as well. I think traditionally, perhaps women have been more led down the diet culture than men, but I think there's definitely a more involved of both sexes now within that food journey. So there's definitely men who are falling to eating disorders. That's very common, particularly younger men. And I think we've got social media and the filtering and the body image distortion to blame for a lot of what's happening with the younger generations and this unrealistic expectation of body shape that is presented in the media, which has always been there, but it's much, much worse now because it's in your face so much more 24/7 on social media, and people are making livings out of just being famous for no reason, and that is quite a dangerous culture to be growing up in when everything to do with that relies on how you look, not what you're capable of, not what you've achieved, what you look like. So that is quite dangerous for me, and it's changing the direction of that men-women relationship with food, and men are definitely falling into eating disorders and having that warped relationship with food at the other end of the scale as well, where they are emotional eating. So there's definitely more of a mix of men and women in there now than before. But let's look at why that is in terms of the sort of the biological relationship with food. And I think another reason why it's changing is our food has changed. Now, you're lucky you're in Spain, so you're probably more used to the Mediterranean diet and fresher food and a landscape that is quite different. Here in the UK and certainly in America, where the food landscape is predominantly foods that are appealing and convenient. So the food that we have available to us is playing to our emotional food attachments, and that is quite a dangerous change in our food landscape, and it's really taken shape over the last 20 years. We've always had these foods that people consider treats. I don't like to call them treats myself, but we've always had these foods that pizza, ice cream, chocolate, cake, biscuits, sweets, whatever you name it, that have always been there, certainly for the last 50 years. So we've always had these foods, but in the last 20 years, their place on the shelf has really taken over. So when we walk into a shop now, that's predominantly what we see. And the placement of these products within shops is very carefully done to make sure that people do see them. They're at eye level, there's offers on them. In the UK at the moment, we should be having a change in the law about offers on these foods, but that's been reversed, unfortunately. So there are offers on these foods, they're right in your face, they're very appealing. And the food manufacturers who design them know everything that I know about the biological relationship with food and how to play on our emotional attachment and what those foods do, which I will come to in a moment. But they know all of that and they place them in a way that when you go into a shop, that's what you're drawn to, that's what you buy. So food available to us is too easy to fall into the trap of those foods. And we can't walk into a shop and be tempted by a broccoli because we're tempted by the things that are in our face. Cheap, unfortunately, healthy food is about 3 times more expensive, available, convenient, and there. So of course, they're the foods that people are buying. They're the foods that they're buying, but that drives up the biology. Let's go into the biology of these foods and look at why they are causing a problem. So as I say, the food manufacturers know how to create foods that are tasty. I suppose I don't particularly find them tasty, but I have developed my palate to prefer real food, natural food. The problem is when you haven't done that. So let's look at a child who's just at a very young age and they're being given a food that is ultra processed. So if a child is given one of these foods, then this food is designed to activate all the pleasure receptors and sensory awareness of this food. It is not a natural food, so naturally our palate responds to certain flavors, but these foods are designed in a lab to deliberately activate all the pleasure receptors. So our dopamine response, how it tastes, how it dissolves in the mouth. We don't even have to chew these foods very much because chewing encourages hormones that tell us we're full. It encourages the hormone leptin. So when we chew real food, we actually get quite full because we've had to go through the process of chewing it, producing the hormone, etc., etc. These foods in the lab are deliberately tested so that we don't have to chew them, put them in our mouth and try it with some junk food and see. It doesn't take much chewing before we can swallow it. And so it's bypassing the human response to tell us that we're full. So there's that side of the biology. So we can eat them and not actually feel full from the process of eating. But the nature of the food also is high sugar, high salt, high fat, a combination that does not exist in nature. So it's all 3 things at once, which light up the pleasure response, the brain thinks, wow. And it's this heady mix that really activates everything. But it's very short-lived. So we get this rush, and we get blood sugar spike, and we get dopamine response, but then it wears off. And because we've not been told we're full, we don't feel satisfied. And then we get a drop, and with a drop of blood sugar comes a drop in mood. And for a lot of people, there's the guilt because they've eaten something. So then you've got an increase of cortisol, the stress hormone, because you've got, I've eaten a burger, I've eaten a pizza, I'm really bad. Men and women both do this. I think historically it did used to be more women, but men are definitely having guilt associations with food as well. And you get the guilt, but then you also have the need to have more. And you don't necessarily want more, but because the food is designed to not make you feel full, not make you feel satisfied, and to be addictive, you find yourself wanting more, but you might not really want more, but you find yourself reaching for more. And that's the danger. It creates a pattern, and that pattern can be very hard to break.
Fascinating and frightening. I mean, when you are talking about what is going on in those labs and the amount of money in food manufacturing, so these big companies have got the money to throw at these labs and say, okay, we want you to create a new snack, a new biscuit, a new crisp item that ticks all those boxes. I mean, that is absolutely frightening. One thing I just wanted to comment on, I read the book, French Women Don't Get Fat. And this book was huge a good few years ago. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I took from this book, it said a lot of French women particularly are very particular about how they eat. And they said, one of the things is they very rarely will eat dessert. And one thing they do is they will share a dessert with somebody. they'll have one spoonful, so they're getting that sweet, that sugar hit, and then that is it, because they're saying that first bite of something, that is the explosion of taste. After that, it really doesn't give you that hit.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, so what they will often do is just have a spoonful of their partner's beautiful dessert, and then that's it. And I thought that was pretty clever, because you know yourself, when you have that first bite of something, that's the magic. After that, it's like, well, it's not quite as good, but I'll carry on because I've started, or there's still some left in the packet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's about self-control, which you can train yourself to have, but these foods do prevent you from doing that. As I say, they stop you feeling full, they make you want more. So it is a really good plan, but it does require, self-control, which for many, their relationship with food is where the food is in charge, not them. And so actually they don't have that feeling of self-control. And that's not something to feel guilty about. So a lot of people, when they feel guilty about food, it's actually so counterproductive to what they're trying to achieve. A lot of people, particularly dieting, and you mentioned in your introduction the dieting industry and the mass money machine that it is. Now, it's always worth mentioning that for as long as we've had a diet industry, and the diet industry came about in the 1970s when we started to think about dietary fat being a problem and linked with heart disease and weight, and it wasn't. And there was one guy in the 70s who wrote his book, Pure, White and Deadly. He said, it's not fat, it's sugar. Nobody listened to him. And it was many, many years later that we started to think, actually, it is sugar. That's a bit of the problem, not dietary fat. But as soon as those health sort of issues started to be raised in the 70s, out came this new industry, this diet industry, this low fat this, low fat that, let's remove fat from the diet. But in went all the sugar to make foods palatable. A low fat yogurt, take the fat out, which is actually quite good for you, put in a load of sugar. Long as we've had a diet industry which came about to tackle health, we've had obesity rates tripling around the world, and more so now. So they were tripling from the 70s upwards. We're now on a much bigger upward trajectory, and COVID and food poverty are escalating that beyond anything we've seen before. And so the diet industry is partly to blame for the obesity problem, and yet we have people who trust and spend a fortune on this time and time again. And the diet industry, owners of the big players within the diet industry, will be very open in saying that they have a successful business model because it's a repeat business model. And I think for people to actually think, actually, they're making money out of me failing because they're setting me up to fail, changes that balance of power in relationship. And that's what I want people to be able to do with the diet industry. No diet. Yes, some people have some success, and some people will stand up and say, well, I lost loads of weight. A few will. The majority won't. And for an industry to be built on its own, say so, that it's a repeat business model and they are only working and getting money because their idea doesn't work and people come back. People need to know that and to realize that and to stop blaming themselves for something that was never going to work for them. And if we could get that message out there, people's own perception and their food relationship could start to change. And that's a big hill to climb, really.
I think it's interesting, at the beginning of the podcast, you talked about me living in Spain with a Mediterranean diet. Over the last 10 years, the amount of American fast food restaurants that have arrived in my city is phenomenal. Identically, the amount of obesity clinics, which we never, ever had before, is just everywhere. And the amount of overweight people, and particularly with children. I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a scientist, but I would be pretty sure to say there is a link between the fast food restaurants and the problem of weight. And I think as well in media, when we see social media, everyone is running around with a giant Starbucks in one hand and a mobile phone in the other hand. We see all the fast food restaurants. I have seen the difference of what has happened, even though I'm living in a Mediterranean country, which is frightening.
It is frightening, and it's sad, isn't it? Because you have this amazing diet and amazing food culture, and all the history of the lovely cultural food, and you know what we associate with the Mediterranean diet and Spanish, and you know other European countries. It's beautiful food, and then in comes the beige, you know, and it does change everything. And you're right. In fact, anytime any country adopts a Western diet, it takes 1 to 2 years to start to see health problems. So it'd be interesting to see your type 2 diabetes statistic, because very likely they would have been low, because the Mediterranean diet is what's recommended for things like type 2 diabetes. And of course, as soon as you introduce this sort of culture of convenience food, we know that things like type 2 diabetes go through the roof. So wherever a Western diet is introduced into a culture, within 1 or 2 years, sickness starts. And so you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out that there is a link. Everybody knows that there is a link. The World Health Organization knows there is a link, and a huge problem. The food manufacturers themselves know. They absolutely know. They, of course, are contributing to the problem. But if they feel they justify their existence by having a carrot stick within a meal now and then, you know, that is offering a healthy solution. But you don't go to these places to choose the healthy option. So whilst it may be on the menu, you've walked in, you've been bombarded with the sensorial, you know, awareness of the burgers, the chips. You're not going to go for the salad wrap when you're in that environment. But because they can tick a box and say, we have a healthy option, you know, they feel that that's their corporate social responsibility done, which it isn't. So there is an absolute direct link, and COVID has had massive detrimental impact, because here in the UK, we couldn't get all of the sort of, you know, the Just Eats and the takeaways as much as we can now. Because of COVID, everyone was like, well, nobody can leave the house, so we better up our game with getting food to them. Now you can sit at home and you can order whatever you like to your door, not in the really rural places. Of course, they're always exempt, but that's good. You know, you can sit there, especially in urban areas, and you don't have to leave, and you can have any number of foods just arriving at your door without any effort. So you could see an advert on the TV. They do it within football. You know, adverts come up saying, order now, it'll be with you for half time. Well, how tempting is that? You have not even got to leave the sofa. You know, so convenience is not the answer. Convenience is certainly shaping our health the wrong way. COVID has had such a bad impact on obesity anyway. Couple in the fact that we've now had all these food companies offering more services. In the years to come, we're going to see a much greater increase in spike in obesity post-COVID, but that's to come, unfortunately.
I mean, one of the things I wanted to cover with you, Louise, is particularly in the Western world, we are very, very lucky. Most of us have the option of, we have money to buy a fast food meal or to go to the supermarket and make a selection. In general, we are in control of our choices and our decisions.
Yes and no. I think because we've got huge rates of food poverty in the UK at the moment, 2022, we've got 4.3 million children living in absolute food poverty. We know that they're going to school without breakfast. We know they're relying on free school meals. We know that during COVID, of course, the government didn't want to feed them, so they weren't even having the meals during COVID until, you know, Marcus Rashford, a footballer, had to stand up and say, hang on, they're literally not being fed. So there's a massive proportion. There's been a 123% increase in the use of food banks in the UK. It's phenomenal, the amount of food poverty that we have. For the 6th richest country, our food poverty is going through the roof. So for many, they don't have a choice. And this is my big argument with food. Is any food better than none? Yes. But the problem for most people in that situation is their choice has been removed from them, which is very demoralizing for an individual. And it's very it puts them in a very horrible situation where they know it's unhealthy. But what can they do? Because if you have a flat or a house in an urban area, your cooker's broken, you can't afford to get it fixed, or you don't have a cooker, or you can't afford to pay the electricity, so you can't have anything hot. But there's a fast food place down the road that does burger and chips for £1. What are you going to do? You're going to go and feed your children for £1 because you can do that, whereas you can't cook something at home. And that is the absolute reality for many people. And their choice has been removed from them. They probably know it's not healthy. They'd probably rather do something else. That choice has been removed, and it's getting worse. And we have cost of living higher than it's been for 40 years, and it's getting worse. And that problem will only increase, and we'll just see more families falling into food poverty.
One of the things, when we go to the supermarket, we can look at the nutritional information on a packet. And I know in the UK you have the traffic light system as well. Yes, we can look at the nutritional information, but unless you can work out in your mind half a teaspoonful of salt or sugar equals so many grams in 100 grams of the product, you know, you've got to be pretty savvy, I think, to be able to think, okay, if I pick up this tin of beans, 2 portions in this tin, okay, there's X number of teaspoonfuls of sugar. Do I want to do that? I can't imagine the average person running around the supermarket to do their weekly shop is going to be picking up all the products and looking at the nutritional information. I think one of the big problems I've come across is the hidden sugars. Sugar seems to be the public enemy number one at the moment. And yes, if you're going to put sugar in your tea, that's pretty straightforward. However, things like tomato ketchup, tomato soup, it seems to be tomato-based products, seem to be pasta sauces, seem to have huge quantities of sugar. And when I've looked on the internet and seen some of these diagrams, okay, this is 100 grams of something, this is how much sugar, and they show you in cubes. Totally visual. I understand that. It's terrifying.
It is, and it's true. I think the hidden sugars are more of the problem than the sugars that we know about. We know the sugar in cakes, we know the sugar in sweets, and yes, they're not great for us, but at least we know what they are, and we don't, eat them 24/7, or some people do, of course, but that's a different story. But in savoury foods and in children's foods, they shouldn't be in children's foods, but they are, and unfortunately, children are being weaned, so from 9 months upwards, on foods that contain added sugars, which is completely messing with their palate development. But unfortunately, they are allowed at the moment to do that, and to package things with characters on and sell them to very young children. Part of the U-turn that the government have done at the moment was about banning these adverts, and it really is a backward step that they haven't. But the hidden sugars are, children get most of their hidden sugars in breakfast cereals and drinks, and the older children get more from fizzy drinks and horrible energy drinks that teenagers tend to be drawn to, particularly the boys. There is a phenomenal amount of sugar in those drinks, a hideous amount of sugar, and caffeine, which of course teens shouldn't be having in great volumes. And we have had some serious health problems, including a death from those energy drinks, and they have a corporate social responsibility, I feel, as well. But that's a different story. So back to sugar. So cereals for children, and this is a difficult one, because going back to the food poverty, would I rather a child had a sugary breakfast cereal and went to school with something in their tummy, bearing in mind that those breakfast cereals have generally been fortified with vitamins such as iron and vitamin D that the child would not otherwise get? Yes, is the answer. I'd rather they had that. But would I rather the food manufacturers did a better cereal, which was also fortified, or didn't need to be fortified because it naturally contained those vitamins and didn't contain a load of sugar? Of course. So to say, sugary breakfast cereals, parents shouldn't be given them, is not the answer that I like to see, which is often what's in the media. Parents should make better choices. Parents should shop better. No, parents can't afford to, and parents are buying a branded product that they trust. And I know you'd picked up on this in our pre-show discussion about trusting the food industry, trusting those brands, because that's what people do. They're the same brands we recognize from our childhood. Their products have changed in 20 years. They've added things into those products. They're not the same. It's not the same food landscape. The parents are trusting. They're giving their child a breakfast. That's good. That's a tick. It's not their fault that that product is full of sugar. So yeah, you're right. They're not going to go around the supermarket and study. The traffic light system is also confusing, because it would bring up natural sugars as an orange or red flag, whereas actually we need children to get the antioxidants from fruit, and we need the natural energy that they get. So dried fruit would have an orange or a red traffic warning, the same as a bag of sweets. So it's not perfect, but at least it's visual, because nobody goes around the supermarket, well, I do, but that's my job, and scrutinizes everything, because they don't have time. Most of the time they've got their children with them, and they're trying to not lose their children or stop children grabbing everything. So you don't have the time or the capacity to study everything. So I always say it's not the individual choosing the product's fault. It's the products that are there to choose from. It's their fault. It's their responsibility to make things better.
What would you advise we can do when we are looking at, creating our menus for the week, doing the weekly shopping list, going around the supermarket? What advice can you give us, Louise?
I think it is doing a list, and it is planning, because if we go into a shop hungry or tired or stressed or all of those things without a plan, then we will be especially drawn to those offers, because they're easy, they're tick a box, I haven't got to think about it, I'm just going to get that. And especially if you've got the children with you, they're generally marketed in a way that is appealing to children. So if you go with a plan and a list, then you can avoid certain aisles. If I don't need the biscuit aisle, there's no need to go down the biscuit aisle, then just don't go down it. Of course, they put offers at the end of the aisles to lure you into them, but you can try and avoid them. If you know what they're trying to do, and if you consider they are trying to trick me, and they are trying to get me to spend what little money I have on things I don't need and on things that don't support my health, then they are not going to win. They are not going to trick me. I am going to rise above that. And if the more people rise above that, the less they will do it, and the more they will have to actually make the change that is needed in terms of having some corporate social responsibility and addressing the problem, because it is just going to get worse. So have a plan, do a list, but also real food. That is so important. Real food. So let's talk about breakfast. A bag of porridge oats. You don't need to go the big, expensive organic ones. Normal oats, cheap as chips, cheaper than chips even. Bag of oats, because if you have the ability to soak them in some milk or something like that with some raisins, and you've got some overnight oats. We need to put them in a bowl, put some milk over them, put them in the fridge, and then have them in the morning, overnight oats. Some children are funny with overnight oats because it's like cold porridge. My little boy doesn't like them, but he loves porridge. So same thing, oats, cheap, warm milk, you have porridge. You can, of course, add cinnamon for sweetness. You do not need to add sugar. Add cinnamon for sweetness, add a mashed banana for some potassium and some serotonin, which helps the child feel calm and content going into school, particularly if they're anxious, which at the moment we have a lot of mental health issues with separation anxiety because of COVID. So oats, breakfast, really cheap, really simple, lots you can do with them. Eggs, again, are a brilliant breakfast if you have time to do eggs at breakfast, because they are rich in a fat called DHA, which supports the frontal lobe. So a child going into an area like school where they have to concentrate, if they have an egg for breakfast, their frontal lobe is packed full of all the nutrients that help them to sit still, concentrate, learn, remember, focus, all the things we expect of a child at school. If they go with a high sugar breakfast, that's going to very rapidly turn into a low mood, fidgety, irritable, almost, aggressive, because when that blood sugar drops, so does the mood. So think about, the cheap foods. Eggs and oats are really cheap. I would always say don't buy the cheapest eggs, because even the more expensive eggs are not that expensive in comparison to other foods, but the nutritional difference in them is immense. And also the ethical sort of standards and those sorts of things as well. So never buy cheap eggs, but do buy eggs, because they are brilliant, nutritionally versatile. They could be a main meal, they could be a snack, they could be anything really.
I think this is really interesting what you're saying, isn't it? I mean, as a parent, the responsibility, do your meal planning, work out what you're going to have for the week, cuts down on food waste, have that list. Try and stick to the natural stuff, and just try not to be swayed by all the offers, because it's never offers on bananas and broccoli, is it? It's always the cheap stuff. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it's just really going in there, standing tall, thinking I'm not going to let this supermarket get over on me, and particularly when you've got a budget to stick to as well. I think that's brilliant advice, Louise.
if we look at it simply, they are trying to trick you. That's what they're doing. And it's not a big conspiracy theory, it's marketing. That's what they're doing. Are these foods ever going to support anybody's health? No. Are they ever needed nutritionally in a diet? No. What are they there for? They're fluff. They're just excess. And there is nothing wrong. I'm not saying never buy a packet of biscuits. I'm not saying that. But when the biscuits control you and not the other way around, then there's a relationship balance of power that needs to be changed. And at the moment, if the supermarkets and the manufacturers are holding the power over you, then you need to stand up and stand your guard and not let that happen, because they are trying to trick you and it is not supporting your health in any way, shape or form.
Well, I think that is the title of the podcast, Louise. Don't let the biscuits control you.
That's a good one.
It's been a fabulous conversation. So interesting. I really feel now when I go into that supermarket, and I have to say, we do not get the offers here in our supermarkets that you do in the UK. And I think when I go to a UK supermarket now, I feel totally overwhelmed by the sheer size, the sheer quantity, and it is quite a stressful thing going to the supermarket now. So I think we've got to keep a firm grip on that list and don't let those biscuits take over our lives.
Don't let the biscuits win.
Yeah, absolutely. Louise, thank you so much for your time this morning and a brilliant conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe on whatever platform you are using. It is free, and if you would like to tell your story, please contact me on allaboutyoupodcast@yahoo.com and let's tell your story.